Hi everyone, Season 10 is just around the corner and with it come Chaos Armor and Chaos Perks. So this is the season theme for Season 10, so I'm sure most of you guys have seen that, but I want to talk about the Chaos Perks in particular and give my thoughts on what is going to be really interesting, really powerful, and what is not really so hot. So we have a total of 16 Chaos Perks. The way this works is similar to other season themes. You get like this little interface, you can slot in a bunch of them. You have access to 16 of these per class with 12 generic and 4 class specific ones. You can have 1 out of 4 unique perks and then any combination of 3 of the others. So this is the TLDR on how you can combine them. So there's 1 magic, 1 yellow and 1 legendary and 1 unique per class, and the rest are the generic ones. So here's the list. This is also updated with the latest patch notes. And I'm just gonna go through this now that we have cooked basically all of the builds. Most of the stuff on Maxroll is updated. I've also been sitting here for the entire week basically just making builds and stuff like that. And there is, well, definitely some that stand out. So let's get into it. Let's start with some of the magic ones. I guess this is probably the only stuff you can really hope for to get while leveling up, unless you really grind out the like chaos rifts in the hell tides. So this is kind of what you have to focus on for the early game. And one of them is actually really good here, which is invigorating attacks. So it says every 5 seconds you gain 100% of your primary resource, but the basic attacks deal 30% reduced damage. Now in the early game, especially with the latest buffs to basic skills in Season 9, basic skills are actually pretty decent these days at helping you to level up. But very soon you'll get the first aspects and then you'll have like a bit of a combo, and you will forget about basic skills very soon anyway, most of the time. But you can get a lot of resources. So this is definitely one to look out for basically all of the classes. I think this is a very good starter perk here that you want to try to get as soon as possible. Then we have Accelerating Chaos. So this creates these chaotic bursts. There's multiple powers that do this. This is kind of the main one here, I guess. And it has a lucky hit component, but realistically I don't really expect anything to happen here with chaotic bursts. This is maybe also something for leveling mostly, but in the late game I don't have high hopes for a chaotic burst build to really shine. Namely because one of the more important perks for this, which is the unique one, actually has an internal cooldown, so you can't like just giga spam it or something like that. This thing still helps you a little bit, gives you a little bit of the cooldown reduction, it gives you a little bit of these extra damage bursts. So again, early game when you don't really have anything, it does actually do like a not terrible amount of damage here when it procs, and some builds have relatively high lucky hit. So something like, for example, Quill comes to mind if you're playing that, or similar, like, you know, high lucky hit abilities on other classes might actually benefit from this a little bit, but not for long, I think. Then you have Unstable Power. So this makes your basic skills a 3-second cooldown, but guaranteed crit and overpower and increased damage. This is also something that is actually not that terrible for leveling up, but I'm not sure if we actually have any builds in the late game that actually play around this in any way. So I guess the idea could be to put like 2 or 3 different basic skills on your bar. Again, maybe in the early game, and then you just kind of like rotate through them and you have like a really big burst, like, you know, once every 3 seconds, but you have like maybe 3 of them, so you can like, you know, do them quite often. But that's probably about it, I think. Traditionally, we have not really seen a lot of like combo builds where we have multiple abilities next to each other, all doing decent amount of damage. It is somewhat achievable with something like basic skills because there's a lot of generic scaling for basic skills, also with uniques later on, but I don't really expect that we're gonna see people do this, and it's also gonna feel somewhat clunky to play if you want to do this like all day, every day with like your main build later on or so. Now we have the rare perks here. So we have Erupting Chaos. This is again chaotic bursts. This is kind of like the, the bad version of the chaotic burst because it's actually just randomly on a cooldown, I think. So the main advantage here is that it also produces this dot for 100% of the initial damage. I did try something with that on, for example, Spiritborn with Noxious Resonance on the PTR, but that was not it. And I also don't really expect, as I said, like chaotic burst to really be a thing. But it could also be just something for like leveling up. If you get that, you can combine this with the other one. It might be okay until like Torment 1, Torment 2 or something like that. Then we have Power Siphon. This is a very interesting one. So first of all, how does this even work? It says it reduces your maximum current resource by 20 for 6 seconds, stacking when you use a core skill. So maximum current resource is not the same as maximum resource. So as an example, you have 200 maximum resources. Then you cast one core skill. Your maximum will stay 200, but you cannot go above 180 anymore, and then 160, and then 140, and so on, until these stacks fall off. They all have their own duration. So effectively, depending on like how much resource you have, you can cast more or less core skills until you just have 0 left. Now, there are two things to consider here. Some builds just have core skills that cost 0, or you can make them cost 0. One example is Crazy Brew that I'm going to talk about in a second. So this is an option to potentially benefit from this without really noticing the downside. And another thing is that some effects are based on maximum resources, but not exactly how much resource you have in that moment. So in that case, you could also kind of like go around the downside. But realistically, Power Siphon just has a very long duration. It's 6 seconds, and most builds in like late game, they will attack probably 2, 3, 4 times per second. So you drain your maximum current resource between like 40 to 80 or so per second times 6. So that is like 240 to 480 less maximum resource if you spam an ability or non-stop. That is kind of rough, to be honest. And it also has the other downside that it prevents certain builds from functioning at all. For example, Capeleke builds on Spiritborn are going to be very big this season. All the core skill stuff there on this class, and other classes have similar issues. So I have actually not really seen a setup yet where Power Siphon really makes sense. It would have to be some kind of like a very slow paced build that doesn't care about resources. Maybe even something like a combo point rogue, for example, might run this. But even then, you kind of struggle to get enough resources to actually just not go down to 0. So that is like the main problem here. It's kind of rough to try to use this. Then we have alternating alterations. Casting a core skill empowers your next non-channel cast of a different core skill. You get 50% refund and 30% damage. Kind of a cool idea, I gotta say. I think also, for example, they tried to make some double core skill stuff work on Rogue this season, but then they kind of pedaled back a little bit on that. So the idea behind this is cool, but I don't really expect you're going to see much of this. The main problem remains, it's very hard to scale different skills at the same time, even when you get some extra perk like this. And you also have to consider that using this perk, you cannot use another perk, and they are generally pretty high power level. So this one is not really particularly stronger than some other choices. And it requires you to have 2 different core skills that you go back and forth with. And we don't really have a lot of builds like that. But there could be some stuff, maybe on the Barb, maybe on the Rogue, maybe even on the Spiritborn, I think, where this might be a possibility. And you can maybe get a little bit of value out of this here. Especially the resource refund, I guess, is pretty strong here. So that could be helpful. But realistically, not a big thing. Now we have the legendary powers. Here's Marred Guard. This is a very important one. So there is a unique power that goes exactly with this. This is a combo between the two, which is the Beast Cornered. Basically, Beast Cornered wants you to be low life, and Marred Guard is the key to being low life. So it says you cannot be healed above 50%, so you're just going to be at 50% all the time, basically. And then again, extra maximum res, a bit of armor, and 100% barrier and fortify generation. Fortify is kind of whatever, you usually get that up very easily, but barrier generation can actually be quite useful for a lot of different sources of barrier. Like a single Earthen Bulwark on a Druid will just give you basically 100% barrier. Or, like stuff like Auspicious on the Spiritborn, or like an Ice Armor on the Sorc, and so on. So suddenly you're gonna have like an entire life pool as a barrier very easily in most cases, so that's kind of nice. And well, you only have to half the life pool, but if you want to make a build where you are permanently barriered, then you actually benefit quite a lot here. And you get tankier from this, and you cap your armor easily here. And then you get the benefits from Beast Corner that I'm going to talk about in a second. So Marred Guard by itself is not the greatest thing, but together with the other power, it's going to be very good. Then we have Chaotic cooldowns. So this is a kind of funny one. So every time you cast a skill, it will be either 2 up to the original cooldown, and you cannot have cooldown reduction. So this is a pretty good power for builds that do not have any cooldown reduction in their setup and cannot reduce them in any other way. For example, if you play a Sorc, you will have usually like a Harlequin Crest in the late game, or other sources of cooldown like Offhand and Tarasha Ring. You have the Evocation passive and so on. So all these things will not work, and usually a Sorc will ignore this thing, I guess. But there will be classes where you just don't really have any cooldown, especially with the Chaos Armors, like taking up all of the like left side slots in the equipment. Yeah, there's not really room for a Shaco most of the time, or maybe other sources of cooldown. And in that case, throwing in the chaotic cooldowns, while you can't really rely on getting a short or long cooldown, it will generally give you a lot of value, especially if you are pressing long cooldowns. So that really depends on, do you have, for example, like an ultimate that you temper cooldown reduction for or not? And if you don't have that, then this could be a very valuable inclusion here. Then you have a Crazy Brew. This is a pretty interesting one. So everyone is rogue now, basically, with their unstable elixirs. You press potion, you get a power buff, and this one is pretty juicy. So 100% resource cost reduction, 80% attack speed. This is cap 2, which is the more valuable one in most cases. And 80% movement speed, kind of whatever for the late game, I guess. So most builds, they will usually be capped anyway. It lasts 5 seconds, has a 15-second cooldown, and you can reduce it with cooldown reduction. So this is kind of insane because it's very easy to sustain potions, especially when you're like speed farming pits and stuff like that. Maybe not in a push necessarily, but even then, usually go through the pits fast enough to at least have a good uptime of this. And then for the bosses, you would have to use it a bit more conservatively and for like the big nuke phases, for example. But it is actually a relatively strong thing. So if you don't really have any other like third power, you just throw in Crazy Brew. This is what I have done on my builds. And there is also the advantage of the resource cost reduction. So in some cases, this might also help you to actually manage your resources and get certain procs a bit more easily. For example, on the Druid, there's a power called Overabundance. Whenever you generate Spirit above your maximum, you get a buff. Or, for example, on the Spiritborn, you also have Kapeleke builds, and they benefit greatly from this. When you press a potion, you're going to get a ridiculous buff that is even more than the attack speed buff, just because of the Kapeleke item. So there is definitely some setups here where this really matters, and some builds that have a lot of cooldown reduction where you get to the point where you can just press this all the time. Or you can even reset this cooldown, for example, on the rogues. I think Preparation can do it, or Epoch Furor at least. So there's a way to do that as well, and actually get this thing effectively permanently on some builds. Now let's go to the unique perks. So we have Chaos Unleashed. This is the final part of the Chaotic Burst powers, and this is the one that I mentioned earlier. This is kind of like what should carry Chaotic Bursts, but it can't because, first of all, these things go all over the place. They hit literally like somewhere randomly, almost off screen sometimes. But also it has an internal cooldown. I think that's like a 1.5 second cooldown or so before you can actually stack up these things after a proc. So I actually tried to make a build around this on a PTR and it just doesn't work because, you know, I was going to proc this thing like 5 times per second. And the average is more like 0.5 times per second. So that kind of like kills any possible chaotic burst build, and this is kind of trash. And yeah, it's not gonna happen, guys, basically. Then we have Brawn over Brains. So this is 200% life, 125% overpower damage, but you have minus 25 res and armor cap at 60. So let's talk about the res and the armor real quick. So typical builds have somewhere in the range of 75 to 80 or so resistances. So this will be like 50 to 55 now. So you take roughly double damage, and then you have armor 60 instead of 85. So you take nearly triple damage for physical damage. But you also have triple the HP. So that kind of just by itself makes up for this no matter what, pretty much. You have the healing received, that helps a little bit. So it's a bit harder to heal up, like your actual like recovery is comparatively a little bit lower, but usually it's fine. And then you get this overpower damage. So this is kind of like the big thing here. It's relatively unconditional, just extra damage if you play an overpower build. And I think most overpower builds will actually just go for this. Because compared to, for example, Beast Corner that I mentioned earlier, you have to combine this with the Marred Guard or else you can't really use this. And here it's just one power, you slot it in, you get kind of tanky, and you have this extra overpower damage. So if you rely on overpower like purely, then this is very good. For example, Pulverized Druid. This, this is perfect. So you're going to be giga tanky and you have the damage. Then we have a Beast Cornered here. This is the last of the generic powers, and this is a very important one. A lot of builds will run this together with the Marred Guard, because it says for every 10% life you're missing, again, 20% increased damage and 5% damage reduction. So typically you'll be at 50% life. This means you get 100% bonus damage and 25 damage reduction. So you are kind of a little bit squishier because you lose half your life, but you get only 25% damage reduction. But generally, those builds will probably also run barriers, and then you are actually kind of like at least equally tanky, or maybe even more tanky if you include like a 100% life as barrier as well, together with this damage reduction. And in addition to that, you get resources back. So every time you attack, you spend life and get resources refunded. And this 30% refund is very interesting because it actually doesn't really drain your life very much. In case you have barriers, it will actually drain your barriers, but it does very, very little. And it gives you a lot of resources back because it scales with resource generation stat. So you get usually some from your main attributes. So for example, willpower on the Barb or something. And then you have, for example, something like a shroud in your build, or you have a resource generation temper on your ring or something like that. And this 30% refund actually then gets increased. So you get a lot of resources back. So not only do you have this damage, but also you can spam stuff a lot. This is very important for a lot of builds. On the Spiritborn again, for example, the Capeleke builds, you spend all of your resources and then you refund 30% of that, but then you also multiply this with your resource generation, and suddenly you get like at least half your resources back or something like that. So pretty good. Now technically it can be like even lower life. There are ways to like drain your life, for example, with Jack and Shell or other things like that. Or if you don't have any barriers, then of course you can take damage and be lower life, but then you're also going to be pretty close to death at some point. So it might be a bit risky. Realistically, you always have to assume you are at 50% here. Now let's talk about the class specific ones. I go through them one by one. Barbarian has 4 different ones, just like all the others here. We have dual threat. So here you can have 2 basic skills on your bar. Typically, this will be Frenzy as the second one because Battle Trance is an extremely strong Chaos armor that basically goes into all of the Barb builds, I think. And then you can either press Frenzy or you can just like auto cast it with this here. So this is like a really nice power for many Barb builds. Mostly just because of the free Frenzy cast that also gives you DR, movement speed, some attack speed if you want, and so on. Then you have Raging Chaos. While you are not healthy, you are berserking, and core skills deal fire damage and necrotic burst. This is like whatever. I don't think that really any build seriously wants to use that. Berserking is very easily achieved, and necrotic bursts are, yeah, not it. Then you have Deafening Chorus. So this is a really powerful one, probably one of the coolest powers that we have here. You auto cast all of your shouts every second, and they have increased effect, but they have minus maximum current fury. So this is similar to the other power I explained earlier. You can have a certain maximum pool, and then you just can't fill it up above a certain level. So as long as you don't care about how much resource you have for your attack, then you are fine. And this is really good. This even creates its own build with the Dust Devil, Auto Shout Barb. I actually made a video about this, and we also have a Maximum Guide for that. So there's this, and in general, if you just want to like have your shouts going off all the time, you can include this here. This is really good. And then there's Single-Minded Fury, which is just kind of like utter trash. There's one cool thing, 50% overpower chance, and that's about it basically. These numbers here are just not really enough to make up for the loss of only equipping one arsenal weapon type. So basically you have to either only use a 200 mace, unequip the others, or the dual wield, unequip the others, or your slashing weapon and unequip the others. So that's basically what you do. So either lose like 1 or 2 or 3 weapons basically. So this is just like too much of a loss of stats and powers and aspects and so on. It's just not really worth it, I think. I'm not sure if any build actually goes for this stuff here. Then we have Druid. So Druid has some pretty big stuff. Overabundance is the name of the game. Every build will run this. This is also relatively easily kept up with stuff like Energize, one of the spirit boons that you get. And there's other ways to generate a lot of resources on a Druid. There's Petrify, there's Earth and Might, stuff like that. So you can do many things. And this gives you a 100% damage buff stacking 3 times. So this is like one of the craziest powers actually out there, and still pretty easy to achieve. So a lot of Druid builds will go for this, or all of them will go for this, and try to include a bit of extra spirit generation. Then we have Purge the Infected, also a very powerful effect here. So you get free poisoning basically, that does a little bit of extra damage, and also provides all of your poisoning debuffs for Envenom and these kind of things. And then we get guaranteed crits, and we get 60% extra damage. Only works for the core skills though. So this is also something that will get into every Druid build. It also like perfectly synergizes with this already because you try to generate a lot of spirit anyway. So this is just kind of the package that you go for, and this is also part of the reason why Druid is so ridiculous in Season 10. And now you also make your companion skills into core skills as well, so they can benefit from all of that stuff as well with the savagery here. So this, I'm just gonna skip the wild transformations for a second. So now you have core skill companions, ravens, wolves, even poison creeper if you want. You can now just spam them with resources. And well, as I mentioned, we are going for a lot of resources and they get extra damage here. So this is, you know, just insane for all of that companion stuff. And also why, for example, ravens is popping off so much. And then we have wild transformations. I kind of like this thing. So you have to like transform back and forth. Obviously, this doesn't work on builds that do Grizzly Rage. So I have one of those, for example, and I'm not running this on, for example, Polarize. But my Ravens build, I actually made this with wild transformations and with shape-shifting around as a human caster. And then you also get 20% crit damage, 20% DR, 20% attack speed. It's just like a really nice combo here to throw in there. But it can also be made up for with some of the other powers, I guess. Now let's talk about Necros. So Necros get probably the overall coolest powers, I gotta say. So we start with Grim Reapers. This is for your skeletal warriors. They have a 25% chance to use Reap, and it does a bit more extra damage. And yeah, you kind of scale with all of your Reap multipliers, or most of them. I tried this on the PTR. It wasn't really particularly strong, but definitely good enough for a meme build, I think. So you might see some people experiment with this. Maybe I'll do it myself as well. I like the idea of this a lot because you have these gigantic like scythes like swinging all over the screen all the time with your skeletal warriors. You can get many of those. You can make them very fast, and it's just kind of funny, but not super crazy, unfortunately. But it could also like produce a lot of corpses because Reap can produce corpses for you. So if you really want to go ham with, you know, corpse usage, then you can get an insane amount of this. Then we have Decimating Desecration. The damage or time effects have a chance equal to critical strike chance to deal 100% increased damage. So this is effectively just crits for dots, but also twice as good, because usually crits do 50% extra damage. Now you do 100% extra damage. So the TLDR is you get 100% crit chance if you play a dot build, just like every other build out there. So it's just kind of like same old thing as every other build. It's just raw power and you want to go for that. So this also makes stuff like Stardust Sky is very good. There's a lot of crit chance. This makes stuff like Perdition very good. There's a lot of crit chance and so on. You definitely want to try to cap that out. Then we have Defile the Dead. You can consume each corpse twice, and consuming corpses creates a chaotic burst, and consuming corpses creates you unstoppable. So that's kind of cool. A nice little addition here. Consuming each corpse twice. If you play something like a Corpse Explosion Necro, then this is obviously really useful. You can also like consume multiple of them at once, but then you have, you know, each of them you can do multiple times. You can get more corpses here. So you can definitely get to the point where you just have like ridiculous amounts of corpses. But there's not that many builds that really care that much about such a large amount of corpses here. So you can make a Corpse Explosion build. The Unstoppable is kind of nice, so you can maybe like, you know, use that to your advantage if you just have like a Blighted Corpse Explosion in your setup, or like summoning a skeleton or something. Once in a while you can do this and get the Unstoppable when you need it, or it just happens basically as you do other stuff basically. That can be kind of cool, but realistically I find this relatively underwhelming. And then we have Alter the Balance here. So that's like the most amazing power, I think. So TLDR, your core skills are now giga long cooldowns, and they like, you know, hit multiple times and do crazy stuff like an ultimate. And the ultimates are now spammable for resources, and they are a little bit like tuned down basically. So this definitely creates a lot of different like build options suddenly. There's like a Bone Storm build, there's like a Soulbirth build. You can do like Blood Wave in a different way. So many cool options here, and you know, also just kind of trying to play around with those core skills as like a big cooldown and trying to reset them and so on is really fun. So I think Alter the Balance is a very fun design. Definitely creates a few new builds that are really good, and something to keep an eye out for here. So this is like one of the really special things this season, because those builds will never come back basically. So if you want to play Necro, then keep an eye out for this here. Then we have Rogues. Unpredictable Alchemy. That's the magic perk. It says imbuements flow wildly, imbuing every basic cast with a random imbuement, and imbued skills deal 40% extra damage. So this first part here is completely irrelevant. I know some people really love their poison puncture and whatever, but TLDR, just forget it. This is not happening. But imbued skills deal 4% increased damage. So this is definitely something useful, because builds that were already imbuing can now benefit from this, and to mind come like combo point builds with cold imbuement, for example. Something like a rapid fire, I think, does that, or maybe most of the other ranged skills actually go combo point, orphan maker, and cold imbuement, for example, for this. And also something like poison TB and a bunch of things like that can be quite useful. Or even like in the very early game when you're playing like Dance of Knives, you can use just like a shadow imbuement, and then you have the shadow imbuement for the entire channel for like, the next 20 seconds, and you will constantly have this extra damage. So in the early game, this can be very useful for setups like that as well. Then we have enervated strikes. So this used to be very cool, and now it's just very plain, but extremely strong. So it says you no longer generate passive energy, but your core skills deal 150% damage. So it's just insane raw power. Energy is not really a problem, basically, under almost any circumstance. You have stuff like innovation, you have to lucky hit restore resources on rings and weapons and whatnot. You can get a lot of that, and you don't need this passive energy generation. You just need some sort of like backup plan for when you actually happen to end up at 0 somehow, but most of the time this should not happen. But then you just need to have something that you can press in order to get some energy back. And this is also pretty easily done. Even stuff like concealment, for example, can do that. Or you just try to get some sort of like lucky hit and get an innovation proc, for example, and then you're going to be fine. But yeah, TLDR, as long as you solve the resources, this is ridiculously powerful. And this like, multi-core skill build stuff that Glitter was going for originally just is not really happening, it seems. And then we have the legendary perk Chaotic Grenades. Stun grenades also trigger a chaotic burst to deal a bit of damage. And then you have, when you drop the stun grenades, you drop one more, you get energy. I mean, Grenade Rogue is kind of like a funny idea. I've played that in the past as well. But again, we have chaotic bursts. This is maybe like the main way to make chaotic bursts work, to be honest. If you try to make such a build, I would probably try it on the Rogue because of this power, but I don't have high hopes for this. So it does look pretty, and that's mostly about it, but Rogue has a pretty high power level. Yeah, Grenade Rogue, you can probably play it if you really try, and if you are accepting that you're going to be a bit weaker. And it's like a funny combo you can do there, I guess. And then you have Hit and Run. Every 15 meters you move grants you 50% increased damage for 5 seconds. The bonus stacks but does not refresh. If the bonus is not active, you deal 30% reduced damage. So this is kind of I gotta say. Mostly because whenever you have like a boss fight, then you will generally not move very much, and you don't want to like, actively move just to get that buff. So it is very nice for like farming and stuff. But whenever it comes to like any sort of like serious content, you will generally stand still a lot, or at least not move that much. 50 meters is very far. This is basically pretty much the entire screen from left to right or so in most cases. So this is roughly how far you have to move. I'm not 100% sure if this even works with stuff like dash. It might not even count the distance that you dash or shadow step and stuff like that. It might be just running. We had stuff like that in the past. Where this didn't really count properly. So TLDR, I don't think you're really going to go for this. You're probably going to stick to Beast Corner for the most part on the rogues for the unique perk. Then we have the Sorcs, Explosive Combinations. So that is a really good one. You get 3 times stacking, 60% buff just for using basic skills. So this is kind of a bit like combo point Sorc now, where you just try to kind of maintain this buff with a basic skill once in a while. So for builds where you don't really want to just perma spam your core, this is very good. For example, Hydra. Hydra, you just include a basic skill, you get this buff, and you're chilling basically. It's very nice, and yeah, there's also like, for example, Firebolt build or stuff like that, where you like just actively cast a basic skill anyway. So there could be various setups here where this makes a lot of sense. And also, for example, if you're playing a lightning build with unstable currents, you can use Spark or Arclash to produce your procs from unstable and also get this buff up at the same time. So this is definitely nice. Then you have Advanced Techniques, also one of the craziest powers out there. So it says your base core skill ranks. Increase the mana cost and cooldown by 10% and further increase the damage by 20%. So this is ridiculous. So base core skill means you cannot convert a skill to core and then benefit from this, but it means all of your core skills all of your mastery skills, and Hydra is also a core skill these days. So it is kind of interesting, but the thing is that this power does not actually work with Hydra. So I tested this on the PTR, and unfortunately the power did not go up because I guess it didn't actually cost anything. So that's a bit unfortunate, but all of the others, this is kind of insane because most of the time you end up with something like 15, 20, maybe 25 ranks. So you get like a 300 to 500% X multiplier here. So it's kind of wild how far this goes at the end. But of course you have the extra mana cost, and that can be a bit of a struggle. So this is why many builds will actually run Mana Shield here. So we're going to go into this in a second. And then we have Mana Infused Conjurations. Conjurations get 30% extra damage. This includes Hydra, for example, a very powerful build these days. But each one drains 5 mana per second, which may also not be a downside thanks to that. And then you get some other small perks here. Nothing really groundbreaking, but you can get these extra ball lightnings here, I guess. That might be something for like lucky hits and so on. This is kind of whatever. This is also relatively whatever, I think, but it might give you a bit more of the cooldown procs. And then you have the firewalls. So if you play like a dot Hydra build, then the firewall could be useful for that. Otherwise, it's mostly screen clutter. And then we have Mana Shield. So this is a very interesting one as well. So instead of life, you now have mana and you have a lot of it, and that protects you. So you can effectively not really have any barriers because barriers are usually based on your max HP. There are a few exceptions like the protector aspect for that. So you can still get some barriers that actually do something, but for the most part, it will be just your mana. One thing to note here is that if you play Hydra with the Serpentine aspect, that consumes all of your mana, and you'll just be left with no mana, no HP, and you're gonna get one shot unless you press Flame Shield at the same time, for example. So there's actually gonna be Hydra builds now that will not run Serpentine aspect, but will run this. And most of the other builds are also fine because you just have like infinite resources basically. You're gonna get a lot of mana, you get 400% increased mana, and each point of int is +1. So typical builds end up between like 2 to 3k int, then times 5. So you have like 10 to 15k mana or something like that. And then you also have mana regeneration plus 5000%. So that's a lot of mana regen. The base is 10, I think. So just like that is like a times 51. So you get 510 mana regen. And for example, you can have a mana regen roll on your boots or whatever if you run a normal pair of boots. So this could get even more. You can get like 1000 mana per second. Or if you play like a conjuration build, you have the Conjuration Mastery like passive that also gives you a lot of mana regen, and suddenly you're gonna have thousands of mana per second, which is effectively life regeneration at that point. So yeah, overall the name of the game is just don't get hit. Forehead basically for the Sorcs. With Mana Shield you try to at least not take too much damage at once and then let it refill really fast when that happens. So this is really nice, solves all the resource issues, allows you to run stuff like this, which is very strong very easily. And it's going to be chilling basically. And finally, the Spiritborn. So let's jump into that. There's actually also some pretty interesting stuff here. Alacrity. So this is kind of nice, especially early game. I put this into like a bunch of little like leveling setups and stuff. 30% attack speed, dash range increased, third attack happens every second attack. This is just really nice to have for like leveling up, and in some cases to combo this with combined strikes. So here it says your base core skills hit additional times in a larger area for 40% increased damage, but have a 10 seconds cooldown, and basic skills third attack resets the cooldown. So now it's every second attack if you use this alacrity thing. Or for example, if you use Sebasonic, it's every attack, so you don't even need that. But you do still get the 30% attack speed, which is nice. And then you have combined strikes. And combined strikes is a very powerful tool. So basically all of the core skills, Kapaleke builds, the potency skills as well, they will probably mostly run this and get like a huge damage upgrade here with the extra additional times hitting. So for example, for Crushing Hand, it actually overlaps. So you usually get like 4 hits instead of 2, and then they do more damage. Also Stinger, you get like 2 hits instead of 1. So you basically have like a roughly times 2, and then like the times 1.4, but you also have to reset it. So you don't really just like spam your core skills that much, and a bunch of these builds have changed quite a lot because of this. And for example, you can now use Sebasonic to evade a Thunder Spike, and that Thunder Spike counts as the third attack, and then that resets. So a lot of builds will run something like evade, core skill, and they are going to be very mobile, very defensive, and you also have enough time to like, you know, position yourself and do the hit exactly in the right place. So for example, Crushing Hand does this, Stinger does that, or stuff like Quill Volley. You just use, like for example, Thrash. You like one attacker Thrash, reset your Quill, do the Quill, and repeat basically. So we have kind of like this combination here of two different skills with basic and the core, and it's very strong. Then we have Back Off. So this is an interesting one. So it's like a ranged Spiritborn playstyle here. We don't have many of those, but there is an option to play Quill Volley with this, because Quill Volley actually has like a ranged option basically, where the feathers converge at a certain point where you aim. I tried this, it didn't seem better than just playing the typical like shotgunning Quill, but it definitely seems much more viable than it used to be. So if you want to do that, you can do that. And then of course there's Razor Wings, and Razor Wings is already a ranged build, and that is really good, and Back Off just kind of fits perfectly in there. So it's just like a straight up ×3 most of the time, and occasionally get like a little penalty here, but this is just very good. And technically there is payback, so there's an aspect for payback to make that ranged. That is also a thing, but I found that somewhat clunky to try to use that. But there are ways to stay ranged. For example, with the new Hesha Kizungi gloves, they're unique for the protector. It actually allows you to cast protector at range, and it pulls everything to that location. So you can still do that kind of combo even with something like payback if you really want. And lastly, Convocation of Spirits. Probably also one of the coolest designs that we have here for the Chaos perks, but unfortunately not very good. So they try to upgrade it a little bit with this line here, the ultimate benefits from all the upgrades. So the TLDR is you just kind of try to stack a bit of ultimate damage, which you can do with Tempers, with something like Flicker Step or Wushnak Pa. There's a bunch of unique items that have a lot of ultimate damage. You try to get to 1000%, and then you have a 10% chance when you cast a skill to summon one of the spirits of the same skill type. So it is actually technically doable to get like 4 spirit types. So you can basically summon all of the ultimates together at the same time if you want, because you can have 1 base spirit, then you can have 2 with Harmony, and then you can have 1 from Wushnak Pa, depending on which ultimate you choose on your bar basically. So you can have all of the ultimates up, and then it's going to be the Hunter, and it gives you like the ferocity and the extra damage against injured. And then there's the Protector, he gives you the barrier and the damage and damage reduction. And then there's the Seeker that gives you the perma crits and knocks everything down. And then there's the Devourer just looking cool. But realistically, it's just not really it, and it's also very unreliable. Like 10% chance, it doesn't sound that terrible, but even if you assume something like 4 attacks per second, which is pretty high, that would mean 1 proc every 2.5 seconds. And some of those ultimates last very short. Like the Hunter is basically over in 2.5 seconds. The Seeker is basically over in 2.5 seconds. Yeah, Devourer will probably be there most of the time. Protector will also show up pretty often, but the other two, not really. So for example, if you try to rely on this effect to get your crit chance with the Seeker, that won't really work out, I think. So yeah, this is kind of like the main problem here, I think, unless we maybe discover that if one of them is already present, it's like taken out from the proc pool, basically. So for example, if the Devourer and the Protector are already there, since they last quite long, and then, you know, the remaining chances are just split between the other two, then this could maybe work. But TLDR, it's very fun, and I might try to cook something with this, but I don't really expect us to go anywhere. And this is about it here. So I went through all of the perks, tried to give my thoughts on this and what I think, you know, we'll see in the builds being used, and also like even some examples of what we can expect here. So I hope you enjoyed this. Let me know what you think, if there's something I kind of missed the mark on, or something I didn't really mention now or didn't think about. That would be nice. Otherwise, it's going to be a very fun season trying to experiment with most of the stuff. I have already had a lot of fun on the PDR, and I'm excited to see what else we'll find out once the season is live. So I have a bunch of stuff coming here for Season 10 videos, so stay tuned for that. Like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.